So, my name's Abe Miller. I'm the development manager. Do we need this?
If you don't want to, you can take that. Right.
You do? You do? Okay.
Okay. So.
It's weird. I'm the development manager at Pat. Sorry, I talk really loudly, so I'm deafening me. I'm the development manager at the Microsoft Patterns and Practices Group, and really this talk is very much about our experiences with doing distributed agile development. I'm going to talk a little bit about who we are and what we do in a non-marketing way, you'll be pleased to hear. And then I'm going to tell you about sort of some of the things we've been thinking about in terms of agile development, how we do it, what the challenges we find with the sort of incredibly distributed teams that we run, and actually why we run those teams. Assuming PowerPoint's going to play ball. So briefly, who are Patterns and Practices? So really our role is producing guidance for systems integrators and typically line of business developers and help them make sense of the Microsoft platform. So I like to think of sort of all the stuff that Microsoft throws out there as this huge sort of field full of Legos. And one of your challenges as a developer is trying to work out which Legos are interesting to you and how do you put them together. You know, do I use Link to SQL or Entity Framework? Do I use this .NET runtime, or am I okay with this one? You know, am I going to use Azure? How does all that play in? So some of the things we've done that you might have heard of are things like Enterprise Library, which is a set of cross-cutting concerns for people building on the .NET platform, so like logging, caching, that sort of thing. Some guidance around WPF and Silverlight that we call Prism. We also do a book, for instance, called the Application Architecture Guide. So we tend to do books, we do code that looks a bit like reference implementations and samples, and we also produce frameworks. So that's really sort of a little bit about what we do. There's a huge caveat here. And lots of people I speak to say, oh, so how does Microsoft do this? And there is no answer to that question because there is no Microsoft, right? Our group is this very small group of sort of 25 people with a bunch of sort of contractors, vendors working for us. So in total, at any one time, there's probably about sort of 40 plus people associated with the stuff that is built this way and comes out of this group. And Microsoft is roughly 100,000 people of that order. There are groups doing completely different things in completely different ways, and as you'll see, they probably should be, because our requirements around building stuff for customers is very different from building stuff for customers if you're building, say, Windows 7 or Office. So don't think of this as how everybody at Microsoft thinks about or builds software, because really this applies to quite a small group of people who hopefully are building the sort of, in some senses, building the sort of scale of projects that some of you are involved with. So not the 48 million lines of Visual Studio, but something slightly, hopefully, more manageable. So the first question you really want to ask yourself is, well, why would Agile teams co-locate in the first place? I mean, the sort of the stock answer from people who consult in Agile is, well, everyone should co-locate. So, why would you do that? Well, there are really these three reasons: communication, efficiency, and driving down risk. So, lots of software is really about communication. Actually, I was listening to a talk in the other room just now talking about sort of the overheads around software and how much time you spend writing code and how much time you spend doing other stuff. And actually, I would argue that some of that other stuff adds value, because at some point you have to talk to the other person about writing the code. You have to get a sort of a group understanding of what you're building. Another colleague of mine was saying that he was doing some consultancy, and he went around this group, and someone said, well, where's, he said, I don't really get this. Where's your domain model? Where's your architecture diagram? And the stock answer was, well, we're all sitting in the same room, and anyone who can't draw us a domain model on a whiteboard, really we should fire them. So this friend of mine went round and he asked all the developers on the team to draw him a domain model, and they were all different, right? So a lot of it's about talking to each other. There have also been some studies done that say you can reduce failure rates by up to 20% by co-locating. I don't actually have those, the reference to that, but there have been a bunch of sort of studies that talk about how putting everyone in the same room, it just lowers a lot of the taxes. So that's really why Agile teams focus on this and why being distributed really impacts you, because it impacts your ability to communicate, essentially. You can't just turn to the person behind you and say, hey, Wendy, why is this code this way? Or what did the customer mean by this? And we'll come to a load of examples of exactly how that might impact you. So if that's the case, why would you distribute? You know, your Agile coach has said, well, we'll put everyone in the same room, and you probably, like me as a manager, turn around and say, no, you know, I can't do that. Why would that be the case? So it really comes down to, again, three things: global markets, talent, and costs. And we'll come to those in order, because they're in an order for a reason. So 50% of the Agile teams that were surveyed in the version 1 study last year said they were distributed. So that's over half. How many people in this room are working on a team where everybody sits in the same room all day? Anyone? We have one taker over there. Are most of you co-located at least in the same building? Yeah, so a fair number, and certainly one of the things I've observed is co-located in the same building can be good, but it can actually mean, you know, well, we're all in the same building, but the test team are off in some other wing, you know, a 20-minute walk down the corridor, and no one really goes and talks to them anyway, or something horrible like that. It's really noticeable. One of the things that we did during the Visual Studio 2008 timeframe was we got everyone doing stand-ups. And it made a huge difference, because everyone at Microsoft has their own offices, except for my team, for a variety of reasons. And so they all go into their offices and they do their own thing. I mean, they might as well be distributed. They're not really in the same place a lot of the time. So the things that really drive this are, there are some cultural things, but global markets. You know, the world is becoming an increasingly small place. People end up acquiring companies in other countries because they want to break into those markets, or they want expertise, understanding of that market. So next minute your team just grew because you now have a development shop in St. Petersburg or somewhere. Or Microsoft, for instance, spends a lot of its time hiring people from all over the place, not because they like sending people on recruiting drives to Abu Dhabi or somewhere, but because trying to find great people who want to live in Redmond. Well, you guys are all from Vancouver, right? So you know what the weather's like. I mean, there are people who just move up here and after 6 months they're just nah, and they go home. Seriously, I've had people who've come and worked for me, and either they or their families have just gone nah, and they've moved back to Florida. And they send me email and tell me how great the weather is, and I ignore them. But you know, there's a bunch of reasons why you start to have to think outside of everybody's just going to be in the same room. Or, you know, I've had people leave my team, I've wanted to keep them, so I've let them be remote, right? I don't want to lose Frank. I spent a lot of time hiring Frank, and I don't want to lose him, but unfortunately his wife says that he's got to go live in Kalamazoo, so off Frank goes to Kalamazoo, and now I have a distributed team. There's also this thing around reducing costs. You know, you'll hear people say, well, I can have a developer in the Ukraine for $40 an hour, and I'm paying $120 an hour for the, in quotes, same guy in Redmond. I mean, clearly there's a dollar cost associated with that. I've never actually seen a cost where you're looking at essentially functionality, not hours per dollar, but functionality usefully created per dollar. Most of the people that work for me would tell you that they would rather have 2 developers in the room than 3 somewhere else working for them, right? That seems to be the sort of cutoff. The problem is that when you start working out the money, the line becomes blurred. I try and seek to get people in the room where I can, but it's not always possible. Although that's largely driven by some of the global talent and global market conversations. We'll come back to how PMP's teams are actually arranged and why. And here we go. So typically we're running a few development teams. We have a total, as I said, of about 25 employees and 30 contractors. The thing we think of the secret to our success is we try and involve customers very, very early on in the development process of what we're developing, in that we We tend to involve them on multiple levels, and we tend to give them code and binaries of the stuff we're building every couple of weeks and try and get feedback off them. It's something that we call customer connected engineering, which is just a nice way of rebranding it for internal consumption in a lot of ways. Typically these projects last 3 to 8 months, and essentially a lot of the time we're mining expertise from the community. So when we started, for instance, on that WPF project, despite the fact that another part of Microsoft actually were the people that gave birth to WPF, my team were not WPF experts, nor were they WPF experts in the way that WPF was used in the real world. And that's an important distinction from someone I might go and ask in the product team, right? Potentially. The guy who developed the guts of WPF probably doesn't see WPF in the same way as one of you guys might see WPF. So we spend a lot of time involving people in the community and getting subject matter experts in to help us. And this is one of the things that drives our distribution, because if someone tells me that the world's greatest WPF experts all happen to live in Tibet, I'm probably going to have to involve them in some way. It's normally very hard to get subject matter experts to come and relocate to Redmond for 6 months of the year, especially between about now and March, inexplicably. So this is what we would like our project to feel like. Everybody's sitting in the same room. Actually, these guys are running the Hubble Space Telescope. They're not my team. I don't run the Hubble Space Telescope. Just wanted to clear that up. They're all sitting in the same room. Everything's chugging along. Everyone can talk to each other. It's all good. In fact, a lot of the time it feels like this. It's like one of those people doing keyhole surgery. And this is all very high-tech and sophisticated, but I bet you if you ask this guy, he'd actually rather be doing what the people in the other room are doing. And the reason I came to this realization was in 2008, I was at the Agile conference in DC, and there were a bunch of people there at a workshop on distributed Agile. And we spent several hours talking about the sort of challenges that we were undergoing on distributed Agile projects, and the, sort of some of the things we were trying to do to fix that. And I basically came to the conclusion that essentially distributed teams sound, if you sort of blank out or redact the distributed word, they just sound like dysfunctional teams. Right, so my test team, they don't turn up till 6 in the evening, and they work all night, and they never talk to anyone, and they refuse to attend stand-up at 10 in the morning, and well, actually they're in India. That's why they're not actually pathological like that. They can't, because that would mean working at night. And you suddenly think, well, what you've really done by distributing your team in some sense is choosing to make it dysfunctional. You said, I'm gonna take this hit because for these other reasons I need the team to be distributed. And the problem is what happens is you said, well, I'm gonna make it dysfunctional, and you never try and put any of the goodness back. You just sort of carry on with the, for want of a better word, Agile recipe, and expect it to work. And you do a bunch of things that don't work very well in a distributed environment, even though you're you just blindly continue and say, well, I'll just expect them to work. So, the obvious thing is this thing around communication. I mean, this is really what it all boils down to. And communication sort of spirals out into other things like trust. I mean, if you've ever, have people here work with really remote teams, so teams in other parts of the country or other parts of the world, right? So it's really easy to get into that them and us thing. Have you ever talked to those, dragged one of them over here or gone over there and gone out for a meal or a beer with them? Have you ever asked them that they're actually having that same them and us conversation, but the them and us are switched round? I know our testers in India are just going, those morons in Redmond. What were they thinking? And a lot of that is around building trust and a collective sort of vision and meaning for what the product is building. And you lose that very, very rapidly. If you talk to people on some of the really, really large projects at Microsoft, so projects with thousands of people you actually see the same sort of thing starting to happen if you're not careful, because even though we're all located in, buildings 40 and 41, there are whole teams I don't even know. I've never met any of those guys. They produce the XAML designer inside Visual Studio and it doesn't work for me. Well, they're now those guys that I have no communication or trust of who produced a broken thing, because they're somewhere in building 41 on the 4th floor in that back corner on the west side. It's actually the same thing in the small scale. So really what you're trying to do there is put some of that trust back in. And there are a whole load of problematic just team practices that fall out of that. I mean, here are a whole bunch of them. I think story cards is quite an interesting one. If you have a story card, you think of it as well. It's what this story is going to do. But really, actually, it's a placeholder for a conversation. Because a story card is this big. You're not going to write the whole story on it. We had a very interesting sort of set of cases of that when I was working on the last project I was a dev lead on at Patterns and Practices, where we were using TFS, but we had essentially these work items in TFS that were story cards, so they had the same degree of content on. And what would happen is, we had a backlog, people would be working on the backlog, and I would go home at sort of 5 at night. The next morning would have stand-up at sort of 10 o'clock in the morning, something like that. And one of our developers from Argentina would have come in that morning at sort of 4 o'clock my time, picked up a story card and started working on it. And you would get to stand up and he'd be like, I did all this stuff, blah, blah, blah. Hang on, Pablo. You did what? And he was, I did this. It's like, I was on the card. No. That's all wrong. You're going to have to back that out of TFS and throw it all away and start again, and we're going to have a conversation now about what we actually meant by the stuff we put on that card that said, build a logging infrastructure. They were better than that. But do you see what I'm saying? That's actually about a placeholder for a conversation, not a spec. And it's very easy to take away that communication component and be left with this teeny tiny piece of paper that you're then not backing up with anything else. One of the interesting things we did around that, for instance, is that we would run a stand-up at 10 in the morning for the sort of stock 15 minutes. And then essentially, for the first half of that project, so for several months, we had, basically after stand-up, would clear up any other stuff we had on the parking lot, and then we would spend another half hour just talking about various things we were designing. So it was basically another standing meeting every day where we cleared up all the issues with all these story cards and bits of the architecture that people just didn't understand across the board. If you played the thingy in the widget game, do you know what I mean by the thingy in the widget game? I used to work with a couple of guys, and every time you asked them to describe any piece of software, it was always a thingy in a widget. They'd say, the thingy communicates to the widget, and you would say, well, no, I have no idea what you're talking about. And I'll come to some of the things that we did to try and improve that on our project. But one of the things we did was that sort of standing meeting where we could thrash out what was meant by all those sort of things. Pair programming is another obvious one. I mean, how do you do that? We tended to do it in the overlap because typically our developers were in Argentina. And we would do it in that overlap in the morning of our day. But the other thing we would do to supplement that, right, you've only covered part of the day there. So the other thing we would do to supplement that is we would still do code reviews. So if you hadn't pair programmed that code, well, you were going to have to get someone to code review it with you before you checked it in, or at least code review. So basically 2 pairs of eyes were always on the code. And then we also would do team reviews. One of the things about P&P is because we ship source code to customers, it's really important to us how the source code looks. Is anyone here familiar with Conway's law? So this is sort of the formal definition of Conway's law. What Conway's law really says is that if you have a team in Redmond, a team in New York, and another team in Paris, there's this nasty tendency for you to end up with 3 components. Things will just gravitate. You'll end up with a team, one team will build this component, the other team will build that component. And it's a very natural way to split up the work. And there are some pluses to doing that. But the downside is that potentially your product can end up looking like your geographical distribution. Now, the user, I submit that your end user doesn't really care about how your product is under the hood, but what they do care about is when artifacts from that distribution surface in the product and in their user experience. And we care doubly about this because, of course, our users are actually looking at our source code, and kind of my lying awake in bed at night worrying thing is I think, well, someone's going to come up to me at one of these summits or at a conference and say, so how come you've got this sort of, this 3-layer architecture through all of this code? And I'm going to say, well, because the guys in Argentina built one layer and then I built another layer in Redmond and some other people did something else somewhere else. And it's a 3-layer architecture, which, by the way, you have copied, because that's what we hope customers will do with some of our guidance, for no other reason than I happen to choose to distribute my team. So I spend a lot of time with our teams trying to get people to focus on user stories end to end, not components that are distributed across different parts of the world. So one of the things I've come up with recently is a sort of a mental model for thinking about how different types of distribution might look and what that actually means. And it turns out there are sort of about half a dozen of them. So obviously, the obvious one is, well, we're not distributed. Everybody's in the room. The different colored dots represent what are essentially different roles or disciplines on the team. So you can think of the blue dots as engineers who do more testing than they do development, or vice versa. The reality is at Microsoft, you still have discipline roles, although we focus quite hard on getting people to muck in and do what's required. The second one is this idea of the team thinks it's together but actually acts distributed. That's why I was asking you about, do you work on the same corridor? Do you work on the same floor? Are the test team 20 minutes away in another building? This is actually really dangerous because in this scenario, no one really understands there's a problem. It's a bit like being in a building that's on fire and everyone's like, well, it seems to be a bit smoky in here, but that's just the way it is. So you can be completely distributed. In a previous job, I actually worked on a team that did this. You hear of quite a few really early stage startups who do this. They don't have an office. Everyone meets once a week in Starbucks and works from home. It turns out this works better than you would think, because the thing that really confuses the communication story is when some people have better access to communication than others. The sort of story I have around this is we periodically bring our developers into town. There was, if they're in Argentina, they fly out, they spend a couple of weeks with us. And there was this one iteration where one guy, Oscar, couldn't make it. And he's the guy off down in Argentina, and every day he would sort of turn up to phone in for stand-up and would have these awful conversations, which was kind of, how much can we show Oscar that we really don't like him? Because he would say, what are you talking about? I said, oh yeah, that was that meeting we had yesterday afternoon with everybody that you weren't at, and now you feel all left out. It's much easier if everyone is distributed, because you can't have any of those hallway conversations. You can't have that informal design meeting in the team room. I'll come to some techniques later about how you can try and involve people if you're doing that. And then obviously you can have this if you use the canonical example of distributed by function is you outsourced your testing requirement, right? You hear of a lot of people who are doing that. They outsource one function to a particular company in a particular place. So you outsource your test team to the Ukraine or India or somewhere. And this has other issues, largely around building walls between disciplines, which is sort of something that Agile tried to solve, right? It said, look, we're all in this together, we're all part of the same team. You, the developer, isn't just going to mark all the bugs no repro and all that, that fun, throw it over the wall, expect the other guy to go fix it problem. We actually use this model. We typically have some, if not all, of our testers offshore, and I'll come to this idea of the team room representative as a way of dealing with that. So this was where this guy Oscar was. He was in this ad hoc distributed model where we just had random people stuck around the place. I actually find this to be possibly the most challenging way to work. It's just very, very difficult to get everybody on the same page and keep them there. And then you can exacerbate the problem by distributing across time zones. There's actually a really good reason we tend to work with groups of vendors out of Argentina. I mentioned the 3 reasons, global talent costs and what have you. First and foremost, they actually had a huge amount of domain expertise in some of the things that we started out building at P&P several years ago. We built a lot of add-ons to Visual Studio, and we discovered these guys in Argentina who were really good at that. And since then, we've built up a really good relationship with them. But the fact of the matter is, they're also only 4 hours difference, even though it's a long way, right? You fly them up from South America and they look like zombies the next day. But the actual time difference is only 4 hours. Working with someone who's probably no further away in sort of the UK is actually much, much harder because they're 8 or 9 hours different. So you really don't have any overlap there at all. And I'm pretty resistant to trying to work with split functional teams across those sort of differences, simply because there's no good time of day to talk about stuff. So we've already talked about this in quite a lot of detail: story cards, pair programming. These are some of the things that patterns and practices, my team tries to do. We have this really rigorous daily stand-up sort of cadence. Given that we've actually been doing Agile pretty much for sort of 5+ years, a lot of teams, you speak to a lot of teams who are doing, have been doing Agile, and they've modified it and they've said, well, we don't really have to do daily stand-up every day because everyone's just kind of in sync in the room. They've been doing it several years. We still do this religiously, like we were a team that started Agile last week. 10 o'clock, everybody's in the team room, everybody's around the conference phone. We typically have all the team rooms we have shared conference phones in. They have projection screens so you can project stuff on the wall, typically the product backlog, what people are thinking about, the tasks for the iteration, are all projected, but everyone's religiously in the team room for that meeting. And it just builds up a sort of a structure that you wouldn't get when everyone's distributed. Everyone knows when they're going to call into it. We have this notion of, this is actually something that quite a lot of teams do, this idea of a stand-up. So the idea is still to get through stand-up in 15 minutes. We do what's called put stuff on the parking lot, which means someone's writing it on a board or putting it in a shared notepad session, and then we'll come to that after stand-up. And then, as I said, with some of these projects, we've actually had follow-up meetings after that to try and get everybody on the same page, especially early in the project with things like design. When everything's in a state of flux, you've not really maybe got all your design fleshed out. So in XP terms, the system metaphor isn't quite there yet. One of the interesting things we've discovered actually is that everyone's sort of, oh, well, you can use live meeting and webcams and all this sort of stuff. It's very bandwidth dependent. I don't think twice. I was on a conference call this morning back to Redmond, and I had, live meeting or some, one of these conferencing tools open, and I had real-time video and voice and all this sort of stuff going. You try doing that to parts of Buenos Aires, and it just doesn't work so well. So I guess what I'm saying is, if you're deciding to do this and you're picking an outsourcing company, you should make sure that they have reasonable connectivity. Otherwise, you're going to be back to phone lines and not much else. Which comes to planning to travel. Not quite like this. That looks fun, but it's a little costly. So we typically have people travel at pivotal points during the project. So I like to get all the developers into town at the beginning of the project, try and get everybody in the room, try and get a shared vision for what we're going to be doing, try and do a lot of that sort of, not upfront design, but try and get the general concepts that we're thinking about and sketch out the overall architecture, just because it makes those telephone conversations when everyone's at home a lot easier to get through. We typically try and bring people in regularly at key points. So for instance, typically the developers I have in Argentina typically come up for 1 or 2 weeks every sort of 6 or so, and we tend to cycle it. So they might not all be there, but there's normally someone from that office in Buenos Aires in the room. And that also builds trust, right? You know, I'm sure, you know, the guys in Argentina will be on the phone, and you know, one of the Microsoft people in Redmond will say something, and they all kind of nudge each other, and then I am their guy who's in the room to say, you know, was that all crazy talk, or were those guys really serious, right? Because he's the guy they trust. He's their guy, right? So it allows you to build that trust bridge across the two teams. And then, you know, one of the big things we do when people come into town is it's not just, when I was a consultant, it was always like this. You know, you turn up, you go to the hotel room, you go to work, you work really hard, you come home, you go to bed, rinse, repeat, and then at the end of the week, you go home. We try and actually take people out, let them socialize together a bit, because then when you're remote again, you've built trust, and you know, when you have one of those awkward conversations, it's what the English call a free and frank exchange of views. They'll remember that actually, you know, you have a dog and all this sort of stuff, and you really are a nice person, honest. Well, I'm not, but everyone else, it works for them. So we tend to rotate people through. And then we tend to bring people in at the end of the project for a retrospective and a ship party. And typically the way P&P projects work, because we write a lot of documentation with them, there does tend to be what I call an end game. So, you know, we try and be done at the end of every iteration, but typically there's that last iteration where you end up having to do a lot of sort of fit and finish wrap-up work, because the reality is we document not only the actual end-user functionality, but also a lot of the source code. So, for instance, if I fix bugs in the last iteration, that may involve someone changing the documentation of the source code around those bugs. So it's very hard to be absolutely done. So it's nice to have everyone in town to focus on that last little bit. We have developers who write documentation, so it's great having everyone in town. We can all kind of help the documentation team wrap up the last little pieces. So even though we're distributed, when people say, well, I'm going to work with this team and I'm never ever going to see them, I don't think you're really setting yourself up for the best chance of success there. I'm much happier if people say, well, I'm going to have people in the room. I know of other people that do this. BMC, for instance, had a paper a couple of years back at the Agile conference where they literally had pretty much everyone who flew into the east coast of the US, and they had teams pretty much scattered all the way across. It was like someone sort of dragged their whole development process across Europe, sort of dropping bits on the way. You know, they had people in, people in the UK, people in sort of Central Europe, right all the way out to Israel. And they brought them all into town for those sort of first meetings to get everyone up to speed. And we also factor it into the budget, right? And that comes back to that whole reducing costs thing. Typically, we actually get the vendors to try and quote for that. So, you know, we say we want 3 guys for 6 months, and we want them coming into town. So give us a cost for that. Don't give us an hourly rate and then add in travel. So we try and do that because we think it's a much more realistic way of getting the thing to be successful. So we talked a little bit about those distribution models and understanding your distribution. We're going to come to this idea of the team room representative. Personally, I try and avoid these asymmetric distributions. I think they work really badly. Having one guy off on his own somewhere is a pretty tough call. It's very isolating. If you've ever tried working from home and a lot, and you discover you're having random conversations with the dog, and people who come to the door who are trying to sell you something, you actually occupy their time for 3/4 of an hour. Not speaking from experience, obviously. It's pretty isolating. It's pretty hard to do things. There's no one to bounce ideas off. I try and avoid that situation wherever I can. I try and get people who are much more involved. Sometimes it's unavoidable, especially with this model we have of subject matter experts, where you need that guy. But even then, we try and get them into town for big chunks of time and pay for it. So this is how my last typical P&P team looked. We had people in Redmond. We had someone in Costa Rica, a bunch of guys in Buenos Aires, who it turned out were not actually all in the same office, so there were sort of multiple circles down there. We had someone doing documentation from the UK, and then we had a lot of our test resources were actually based out of Mumbai in India. And because of the way P&P works, we've used people in lots of other countries as subject matter experts. The Ukraine, we've had guys from Montreal, we've had people from Vancouver, all over the place. Largely because we're looking for global talent or global expertise on a particular thing that we're interested in doing guidance on. Yeah, and that's some of the other places we've pulled people in from. So I've covered most of this stuff. The next thing I want to go into is this idea of the team room representative. When we use test teams, we've typically used a lot of test teams out of India for a variety of reasons. And obviously there's no overlap there. Did I just lose sound?
I think it's okay.
Can you all hear me all right?
Yeah.
Okay, so I said I was loud. There's no overlap, right? So what we tend to do is use this idea of the team room representative. This is the footprint of our current representative who went to the moon. And really what happens is we'll have a test team based in India of, between 2, 4, 5 people. And then we have someone we call the team room representative who actually works full-time in Redmond. This is largely because of the way that team is structured, and just the ins and outs of traveling that far is just prohibitive. So we'll have this guy who's based in the team room. He knows all the people in India. He doesn't work for us. He's part of that company. He's probably worked for these guys quite a lot, so they trust him, right? And he appears to, I like to think of him as appearing to the team in Redmond as like this super uber tester, right? You basically say, the guy I had on my last project was this guy called Manny. You'd say, Manny, would like this tested this evening, and the next morning Manny has managed to do the work of 6 people, right? Because his job, and typically, it's a tough job these guys do. They typically come in a little bit later than the rest of us, but they're there in time for stand-up, and then they work through into the evening, and they spend the last couple of hours of their day overlapping with the guys in India, so from sort of 6 till 7:30. They spend that part of their day basically getting the guys in India up to speed. I'm not saying it's a foolproof system, but it's something we've proven, we've shown can work, right? And then that guy's job is to make sure that any concerns we have or any concerns they have kind of get communicated both ways. You can use this same approach with this idea of the one remote guy, right? If I went back and had my time with Oscar again, I would have appointed someone in the room whose job it was to remind us that Oscar was around every time we got sidetracked into one of those side conversations. And either call Oscar up if he was around or sync up with him some other way if he wasn't, to keep him up to speed. So we've used this quite a bit with the test teams we've had in India. As I said, it's not ideal. Essentially, you've isolated one portion of the team. Potentially you can be playing this, well, I'm going to throw it over the wall to the test team or the dev team or wherever, and they're probably saying the same thing about us. And you can get this whole them and us thing going on. It's also hard if you're trying to transfer large amounts of knowledge. So if you're ramping up a new team in India who have no knowledge of the particular problem domain you're dealing with, so for instance, the project I was working on made very heavy use of visual designers within Visual Studio, a thing called the DSL toolkit. It was new to us and it was very new to them. And just helping them understand how this thing worked and how it was plugged together was quite challenging, especially when you're basically conduiting the knowledge of 5 people one end through one guy to get to 5 people the other end. Some of our teams have actually done regular joint meetings with everybody in India just to get everybody up to speed. But we've used this quite a lot on several of our projects, and it's pretty successful for us. So coaching the team. Why does this even play into the whole distributed thing? Really, it plays into the distributed thing because it's that much harder to do distributed. You know, it's much easier if you've got a developer on your team who, I don't know, he's not very good at, well, she's not very good at test-driven development, right? The easiest thing you can do as the senior developer or coach or whatever on that project is go sit down with them and help them with it. It's also much easier to have that awkward, you're kind of not very good at this conversation, if you know you can have it face to face. Trying to tell someone that the code they just checked in isn't up to par and they're going to have to redo it when they're remote in Argentina and it's the end of their day and they just want to go home is pretty tough. So it becomes very hard to get people up to speed. I have a friend who's a Scrum coach. That's all he does pretty much all the time. A guy called Mitch Lacey who's based out of Bellevue. And he says, you know, basically he expects a team to take sort of around 3+ months to form. You know, you throw a bunch of people in the room and about 3 months later they might be behaving somewhat coherently as a team. Well, if you're trying to do that and coach a team that's distributed, he figures you're looking at about double that, right? So another thing that we'll come to in a bit is this idea of not churning your teams. So one of the things that, you know, we've been doing Agile for a while and we kind of thought we'd figured it out, and then we discovered that, you know, these things were dropping by the wayside. So I think largely it was because we didn't really have anyone on the hook. I couldn't walk into a team room and go, right, so who's the coach? So we actually went back and we said, look, you know, someone is going to take this role, and really that role on a distributed team is not to be the practice cop, but it's to remind people that you know, there are these underlying principles, and by skating on retrospectives, because they're kind of hard to organise when you're distributed and you're on the phone and they're sort of, you know, they're difficult. By skating on that, it's going to be really hard to improve. So we sort of went back and sort of had this realisation that really you've got to have someone whose job it is to kind of prod everyone in the right direction. And if you just sort of leave a distributed team to its own devices, it's very easy for it to fall off the rails. Not in a disastrous way, just in a you kind of feel like, well, this could be going better, but you know, we'll just leave it because no one's really prompting us to go fix it. And then the other thing is to make time for it. So have someone on the hook and then make sure that there really is time to do things like retrospectives and do some of those practices. So you essentially have to take some sort of velocity hit. I mean, you're probably taking a velocity hit anyway, just because of the fact that you're distributing activities. But you know, make time for things like retrospectives. Setting up a retrospective just takes longer if you're distributed. You have to run around picking the right time. You have to get everybody on the phone, which means setting up the con call, all this sort of stuff. You know, there's just more of an overhead for doing all these things. So you have to really make time for it. And then this goes back to Conway's law. I mean, understand the distribution of your work. You know, Conway's law will tempt you to localize everything, to have teams building components and components that turn into user stories that get wired together. If any of you have seen Baz Vode and Craig Larman's book on large-scale Scrum, that has some really interesting stuff about systems thinking and what happens when you do this. And essentially, you know, what we see is that you end up not focusing on the user story, but everyone goes and focuses on, you know, the database. You know, you've got a team who just care about the database tier. Well, my customer doesn't care about the database tier. Well, actually, my customer probably does because they're pulling it apart. But a canonical customer in a, you know, who's bought your, I don't know, web-based CRM system. You know, a lot of the people using your CRM system, you could say, well, you know, there are these gnomes behind the scene who are using all these filing cards. They don't really care it's a database. So this is how the space station was built, and as you can see, you know, different countries get different colours. I guess what I'm saying is that if you try and do this with your software, your user story involves someone being able to dock with the space station and get on board and stay there for a week without suffocating in the horrible cold vacuum of space. That involves looking at all these components, and what you really need to focus on ultimately in software is the user story, not how the components fit together. So for instance, I spend a lot of time with our teams making sure that you don't end up with these silos of expertise forming by letting one particular group of people own one thing. Right? This is the same as if you've heard people talk about the truck factor or the lottery factor. You know, how many people on your team would it take to win the lottery and quit before you basically killed the project because, you know, Fred was the only guy who understood the database schema and he just won the lottery and he's gone, right? So we're killing the project. It comes down to a lot of the same things. Yeah, so as a dev manager on the project, I never want to hear, oh well, this particular UI widget was developed solely in Buenos Aires and no one else knows anything about it. At that point, I kind of start to get leery. Especially as a lot of these guys, we use contractors, so you know we might not get them back for another project ever. They might move on to something else. Which actually brings me to my next point. So this is one of NASA's practice space probes. This was not. I think this is Gemini actually. At the end of the Gemini program, which was really sort of this big build-up to putting someone on the moon, they didn't throw away all the thinking and the whole team and say, well, we're going to hire a bunch of new people. They took a lot of people who'd been on the Gemini program and they put them into these into the next program, you know, the Apollo program or what have you. Largely because, you know, teams take time to build, practices take time to learn. I was in a talk previously which was talking about this notion it takes 10,000 hours to get good at anything. Well, not only does it take 10,000 hours to get good at anything, but it also takes a significant amount of time to learn how to work with other people, right? You know, I've worked with some great people who literally I know what they're thinking before they even say anything, right? Or more amusingly, the product owner can ask either me or the other kind of senior dev on the project. You know, when people do this, you see kids doing it all the time, right? They'll say, "Dad, can I have a new truck?" "No." And then 5 minutes later, you'll hear them in the other room. "Mum, can I have a new truck?" Right? And you'll see people doing this, you know, as adults too. And it's really interesting when you get exactly the same answer from all the dev leads on the project or all the devs on the project. They all go, "No, we can't have this feature, this iteration." So one of the challenges we have, and one of the challenges you'll see, especially if you're outsourcing work to companies and doing work through contract, is it's quite hard to get the same people back again. So we actually will sort of expend time and effort trying to keep the same people together over multiple projects. And sometimes that means working quite closely with vendors and subject matter experts to try and get the same guys in, because we know that as a distributed team we're going to pay an even bigger tax for that than we would have if we'd been a team co-located in the room. We also have some sort of material for ramping people up, you know, team and project wikis, stuff like that. There's typically, you know, a couple of books we suggest people go read, which are not, you know, they're not earth-shatteringly different from the sort of books you probably would tell your people to go read. You know, they're the Scrum book, one of Kempbeck's XP books. But just, you know, here's a grounding of what we're thinking about here. So when someone says iteration, if you've not done the Agile thing before, you know what we mean. In a lot of cases, we tend to work with vendors who kind of are doing that anyway, so that's not really the issue. And then obviously, you know, you're building this team, you're focusing on retrospectives, building it up over time, you're investing in it, and then you're hoping that you're going to be able to recoup that investment by trying to keep people together. So, Microsoft's a tooling company, or large, you know, I work for developer division, which does nothing but build tools. We build lots of other tools too. So, you know, and people are actually, you know, just tool using animals really, you know, it's the whole opposable digit thing. My dog's really jealous of my thumb. So, you know, what sort of tools can you provide? And it's interesting, people will say to me, they'll say, oh, so you do this distributed thing, this thing or that thing. What software or what tools do you use to do it? And my first reaction is that tools are a third order effect, right? If you haven't got good people, or you've subjected them to some horrendously random or just stupid process, that's not going to help either, and tools are not going to solve any of those things, right? It turns out that in a distributed sort of environment, you're actually more reliant on tools than you might otherwise be. And by tools, I don't just mean, software management tools like, source code control and project management tools. I mean, the telephone is a tool, instant messenger is a tool, webcams are a tool, right? You start to need all these things, whereas, the canonical approach is, well, I'm just going to use sticky notes all over a board, right? That doesn't work so well when half your team isn't there. But the interesting thing about tools is that really you can think of it as, you start off with this by-the-book process, right? That's the thing, you got the Scrum book and you went and read the book and you said, that's Ken Schwaber's process, right? But all Agile processes are adaptive. So over time, you end up adapting it, you move it. You say, well, this thing works for me, this thing doesn't. This is what the tool is providing you. Right? Now, hopefully, the tool overlaps both with the book process and is also adaptable, right? In order to adapt to the things you've done with it, right? So, for instance, if you're using a bug tracking system and it has some sort of workflow associated with it, you might decide that, well, the way I deal with workflow is very lightweight. I want to remove a whole bunch of steps in that workflow so I can have bugs that are either essentially opened or closed, right? The tool might have come with a whole bunch of stuff down here with 15 steps as to how you track your bugs. And this is something you want to watch out for when you're selecting your tools. The reason people like sticky notes is because they're really easy to use and they're really easy to adapt. I've seen teams go from that standard sort of 3-column, pending, in process, done, sticky note thing on a whiteboard to sort of having 5 or 6 columns because there were other things they wanted to do. For instance, they wanted to have another kind of column for, well, I'm done with documentation, or documentation has done something with this, right? Because our teams are typically very focused on producing written documentation around what they're doing. Well, on a whiteboard, that takes about 5 minutes, right? Someone draws some lines, someone shuffles some sticky notes around, you're done. Ideally, in your tool, it would be that easy too. And in reality, some tools are better than that than others. This isn't a pitch for Visual Studio Team System. It's people. This is a separate conversation. This is just, people ask me what do we use, and these are typically the things we use. We actually have an add-in for Team System called Scrum for Team System, which was built by a company called Conchango, which I believe is now owned by EMC. But we have a bunch of different things we use, like Live Meeting and Live Messenger. I mean, there are a whole bunch of equivalents of these. These are just the things we use. There's a lot of other stuff out there that you can substitute these things for. The interesting thing about tools is you can also think of them as big visible charts. Has anyone heard of the whole Ron Jeffries big visible charts thing? Okay, a couple of people. So this is Ron's definition of a big visible chart. As you can see, NASA are quite into big visible charts. You can't get much bigger than that. You can also have a big visible chart, and this is what Ron typically means. It's a drawing in a team room, right? And really, it's getting people to walk past something every day that reminds them how good or bad something is going. And the interesting thing about a distributed team is that how do you replicate that behavior? And one of the things we've done is we've used continuous integration to try and replicate that behavior by doing things like driving graphs that are big visible charts off our CI servers. So this is actually a little story about how long does my build take? It's a CI system, the build really should only take a couple of minutes. Clearly a series of horrible things happened at the orange arrows, and now it's up to sort of 6 minutes. And eventually someone found the time to go fix that and bring it down to something more sensible. So that's another thing that you can use tooling for. And it's not really something that you can afford to sketch on in a distributed environment. You're going to have to kind of think about all this stuff. You're going to have to think about whether the tooling is matched to the bandwidth, right? So, for instance, I wrote this white paper. I'll give you a reference later on doing distributed agile development. Everyone I sent this to review it said, "What about webcams?" And I was like, yeah, why don't we use webcam? You see, I've become a manager now, so I'm totally divorced from the reality of what happens in the team rooms. But so I said to my guys, I said, so why aren't we using webcams? And they said, you've got to be kidding me. The bandwidth we have to Argentina, I'm lucky to get live meeting up. And you want me to do real-time video on top of that? No, not going to work. So you have to make sure that your tools are matched to your bandwidth. Another good example of that is, are you really going to expect people in India to check into your source code control system directly? Or are you going to set up some sort of proxy for them, right? Now, I can see someone at the back nodding. They've obviously got a team that's tried that. It's not a happy thing. That's just another example of where you're going to need to think about not just the tooling, but also your essentially network infrastructure.
What about distributed source code control?
Like
Git?
Git.
That like Git or Bazaar or Mercurial? Or...
I'm aware of them. I have developers who played around with them. Actually, one of them gave us a really interesting presentation on Bazaar the other day. We haven't used them. I have to say that, I work for Microsoft as part of developer division. I'm supposed to be giving guidance to enterprise customers on how to use things like Visual Studio Team Systems, so it's not really a surprise that that's what I'm using. But yes, things like Git have a lot of advantages in that sort of scenario because they don't expect you to be connected. I've got a few more minutes left, so I'm going to try and wrap this up. Really, in conclusion, I think what I want to say is that it's really about letting the principles behind Agile, these principles of communication and what have you, drive what you do and adapt your process. And it's going to require some significant effort, it's going to require travel, it's going to providing the right tools. It's not something that just falls out overnight. I think we're going to see more distribution, not less. This is actually humanity's best effort at distribution. It left the solar system several years ago, having been launched slightly before I was born, I think, so clearly they could have hurried it up a bit. But these things aren't going to go away. The world just seems to be becoming more and more distributed and disconnected and what have you, or connected and yet disconnected on a people level. There are other approaches I haven't even covered here that people have been successful with. There's this idea of follow the sun development where you have multiple dev shops around the world and basically the story kind of follows it round. There was a really interesting talk this year at the Agile conference with some people who'd used, it wasn't Second Life, but it was one of those virtual reality systems like Second Life. They'd created a virtual team room in it. And they were actually doing all of their stand-ups and everything in this virtual team room. It was really cool. What was also bizarre was that the company in question they were an insurance company. It wasn't, well, we're really trendy, we're all designers, we build games or something. It was like, no, they did insurance. And yet they basically blown the rest of us away by coming up with this thing. I mean, there's lots of new things appearing, and that's certainly one of the ones I'm interested in having a look at. I think I have a couple of minutes for questions. The three I'm not going to answer is there life on Mars? Is the standard model of particle physics correct? And what's the age of the universe? But other than that, I'll pretty much give anything a go. That's easy, 42. You all know the answer to that. The decks are available up there. There's a bunch of other resources too, including this white paper. If you go to that first URL, there's links to other stuff. I think I got a couple of minutes if people want to ask questions.
Yeah, I get about 4, I think.
4. So if anyone has any questions, I'll be pleased to take a stab at them. No? Then I think I'm done.
I'll have one. Follow the sun. We sort of try and do that. Have you attempted it at all, or?
No, I know of other teams at Microsoft who have, and they've had reasonable success with it. For those of you who don't, sort of follow the sun is this idea that you literally have, the sort of the canonical example is I've got, a development team on the west coast of the US, another one in, say, the UK, and a third one in Singapore. They're roughly 8 hours time difference. The guy in the west coast of the US starts the story, gets halfway through it, checks in the results with all the tests. The next guys pick it up as they come online at the beginning of the day. They do some work on it. They then pass it off to the third guys in Singapore who hopefully maybe they finish it up. There are actually some interesting things about that approach that we learned from doing the whole testing remotely, is you better have your act together at the end of the day, because otherwise you ain't going home, because you're going to basically ruin the next guy's day. We actually changed the way we did builds, because I got really, really bored of having the build break at 5 o'clock and then having to stay late in order to fix it so that the Indian test team could look at that day's work at 6. I actually would do a build at 1 to make sure that no one in Argentina had done something to... We were doing continuous integration, so these were actually deployment builds. We would run 2 deployment builds a day, just in order to make sure that we caught things early, so I didn't have 45 minutes to fix stuff. So that's one of the challenges that things like Follow the Sun can...
We also found that when you were stuck at the end of the day, your brain was fried. The guys in India would actually be all fresh, like a daisy, and they would solve in 5 minutes. And the same thing would happen at the end of their day, so it's actually quite a good method.
Okay, cool. Well, thank you very much.